do you think it's possible that the reason I believe in God, even though, well, you would say it's highly probable God does not exist, would be your view?
Highly probable is putting it a bit
probable,
strongly.
More than 51%.
I would say I kind of lean towards it. I'm always suspicious of putting numbers on credence to beliefs. I think, what does it mean to kind of believe something 20%? Like, I don't really know what this means, but I certainly lean more towards strong atheism, but I wouldn't be able to put a number on it.
So what I would say is, if you're asking me, what do I think you've done wrong? It'd probably be the same answer you would give me as to why I have a misplaced confidence God does exist. I have made, there's different reasons why people believe or don't believe. And I think it's possible smart people can fail to believe certain things because they make certain cognitive errors. It's not necessarily a moral error, but we find certain intuitions more plausible than others. We make different inferences. We have different values of different kinds of evidences that are presented. And we look at the world in different ways. So, for example, when you look out into nature and you see the evil, the suffering, nature red in tooth and claw, human suffering, I see that, but I also see other strange things. I see a moral obligation to help people, and not just people, but a moral obligation to help non-humans not suffer, as if I have this command to do that. Though I do see that the humans who suffer have a dignity and a value that the animals do not. And I see hope and virtues. I see other things in there that make me look at the picture in a different way, if that makes sense.
But of course, it's different, because from an atheistic paradigm, I wouldn't expect that everybody who honestly seeks the truth will find it. Like, on an atheistic paradigm, people can very easily seek for the truth and just get it wrong. There's no guiding principle here. There's nobody who is there to catch you where you go wrong. On Christianity, if somebody goes honestly wrong, you'd expect them to be guided to the truth, because there's a God who wants to come to know this person, and they've gone wrong through no fault of their own. This is why Schellenberg shifts from, he used to talk about, originally the argument was formulated in terms of reasonable and non-reasonable disbelief. He swapped to saying resistant and non-resistant unbelief, because these are two different things. You can reasonably believe a falsehood, and on atheism you can non-resistantly believe falsehoods. There's no problem with this. Of course, you can be open to something being true and just not be convinced of it. There's no problem with this. But if you believe that there's somebody overseeing this who will look at people who are honestly seeking and they go wrong, and just somehow allows them to go wrong, because it would be so easy to fix. Most people who come to Christianity do not do so because they've read a syllogism in a book somewhere. If you ask a friend who's a Christian what their conversion story is, if they weren't a Christian all their life, it's incredibly rare that you find somebody saying that they read a particular argument and they just suddenly drop to their knees. Rather, it's usually something more experiential. Maybe the arguments that they're reading inform something that they've experienced, or maybe they have an experience that is informed by things that they've read, sure, but it's the experience, it's that feeling that actually causes somebody to convert. So for somebody who's non-resistantly non-believing, all it would take is a sign. All it would take is an experience that this person can interpret as a religious experience. And that's all I'm looking for here. And so in other words, you say, well, I'm saying to you, isn't there a problem that people non-resistantly don't believe in Christianity? And you're saying, well, it's the same as me, non-resistantly not believing in atheism.
Right.
Two things.
Because you believe there's no God of atheism that could set me straight, but there is a God in Christianity that could set people straight.
Not only that, but there's another asymmetry, which is that I'm an atheist, you're a Christian. I want to be a Christian. You don't want to be an atheist, presumably.
I want the truth, and at this point in my life, I'm highly convinced atheism is not that thing. So you're right, it's not something I'm trying to actively ascertain. But I think then, so the argument that you're running in, this divine hiddenness argument, why would God allow people to remain in error about his non-existence? Wouldn't we think that God would intervene? I think you're right that divine hiddenness is a subset, really, of the problem of evil. We could just call it the problem of bad stuff. Animal pain is bad. Not believing in God is bad. Why would God let bad stuff exist? And my question for you, Alex, would be, I guess I'll run the argument this way and you can fill it in how you like, that if there are at least isolated cases where we see bad stuff, but we say, oh yeah, I understand why God would let that bad stuff happen, like minor moral evils between human beings that allow us to grow in virtue. Say, okay, I see why God would allow this kind of bad stuff. Here's the circle of bad stuff. I see why God would allow it. Then it seems like, well, we've got this other bad stuff. I don't see why God would allow it. But from my perspective, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, here's this circle. He could have reasons. I mean, who am I to say he does not have reasons for this other stuff? And also, it's not just that I would say, who am I to say he does not have reasons? I can think of some plausible reasons. So one that comes for the issue of divine hiddenness, I'll give you a few things to chew on there. Number one, I think that God wants to keep an epistemic distance so that we have more freedom to be able to engage him and pursue certain kinds of goods, like sharing the existence of God with others. For example, when you see police lights behind you on a freeway, you slow down not out of goodness for the other drivers, but because you don't want to get caught. Now, I'm not saying this is the whole answer to divine hiddenness, but I think that God, he gives some space, number one. Number two, an answer to divine hiddenness might be related to the other problem of evil. Because you're saying, well, look, if someone has gone astray cognitively in that they failed to recognize God exists, why doesn't God step in and correct that if he loves them? A similar question is, when someone goes astray and acts immorally, why doesn't God step in and correct them? Well, he lets us have free will. If he gives us moral freedom, I also think he gives us cognitive freedom. And I think he gives us that cognitive freedom so much so that even things like giving everyone a feeling that he exists, giving that sign, I'm kind of skeptical that would be sufficient, because there are people, Alex, philosophers, frankly, you're one of them actually, who don't believe in the existence of things that I think are patently obvious. Free will, self-consciousness. There are philosophers who think they're eliminative materialists, so they don't think the conscious self really exists. And that seems totally obvious to be real. So I guess that's a thought I have on this negative case for God. And the way I would look at it is to make it simple, is that, look, if we have reasons to think God can allow some of these bad things, who are we to say he does not have reasons for the other bad things? Here are some possible ones. And then there are marks of goodness in there that I still want some explanation of. So I guess that's how I would look at it a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so let's kind of take this in order. The first point is to say, there are some circumstances in which it seems, at least plausibly the case, that God would have good reason to allow suffering. That there are sort of maybe cases of small amounts of suffering, or cases where it's clearly beneficial in some way, it serves some higher order good. And if we're willing to accept that, God has good reason to inflict this form of suffering, or to permit this form of suffering, why not think that he has reason to permit more suffering or different kinds of suffering? I can answer this by analogy, maybe. A famous analogy that's often given in the context of a discussion that's quite helpful is to imagine a child at the dentist. And the child's too young. You can't explain to the child why they're undergoing the pain of the dentistry, but we all know that they're going through it because there's some better cause that's being served by it. Of course, if the parent was in the situation where they were able to prevent the child from needing to go through the dental operation in the first place, then forcing them to undergo it would make them quite cruel. I think that's more like the situation God is in. But I actually want to imagine that you see a parent who, and maybe you don't know anything about dentistry, maybe you're from an isolated tribe or something, and you see a parent kind of taking these sharp objects and digging into a child's mouth, and you think, oh, this looks pretty bad. Someone explains to you about dentistry, and you think, okay, right, so there's good reason for the parent to be inflicting this kind of suffering. Now, if we consider the kinds of suffering that we see across the natural world, we're not just talking about these kinds of cases of obvious benefit or menial suffering. We're talking about deep, intense, unimaginable suffering. So now imagine that you were walking along a road and you saw a parent just mercilessly beating up a child, just ripping the child limb from limb, just punching it, like contorting it out of shape. And you said, this is terrible, this is disgusting, and we need to intervene. And I said to you, well, look, hold on a second. You accepted that a parent might have good reason to inflict suffering on their child if there's good justifiable reason. And if you're willing to accept it for these kinds of suffering, why wouldn't you accept it for this kind of suffering? It's at least plausible they have good reason. Maybe there is some kind of reason that we are just incapable of understanding about their relationship, where this is something that needs to be done and is morally justifiable. But I don't think it just follows from the fact that we can imagine some circumstances in which the infliction of suffering would be permitted by a good God, that we should just hypothesize that even if we see a great deal of apparently meaningless suffering, we should just conclude on the basis of that, yeah, he probably has good reason for that too. I just don't think that follows. The first thing was about epistemic distance, which we haven't spoken about yet. You say, well, maybe the reason that God puts a distance between himself and us is for the same reason that a parent might distance themselves from a child, such that they don't feel constantly overbearing. They need the freedom to be able to choose to do things for their own sake, not because they feel like somebody's watching over their shoulder. But pay close attention to what I'm asking for here. I'm not asking for a constant and continual washing over of divine presence that follows me around everywhere I go and I'm unable to avoid seeing it. I'm just asking for something, just once, just one experience in my life that speaks to the existence of a creator of the universe.
But
once.
Sure, but
this would not be overbearing. This would not be enough to make me to impinge upon my freedom. This would not be enough to make me feel that every time I was doing a moral decision, I had someone watching over my shoulder. This would just be enough to establish the existence. In the same way that a parent may distance themselves from a child in order to allow that child to grow up freely. Nobody likes a parent that hovers over their child for all their lives. But I can assure you that that child has had some experience in their life where they become convinced that their parent does in fact exist. This will be because they've at least once in their experience had direct experience of that parent. That's all I'm asking for here. So I don't think that objection works.
The full conversation that the clip you just watched was taken from is available via the link that's on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.